welcome to another special episode of Surge Streams, where we dive into the stories of students that are pushing the envelope and the stories that are going to help you make a difference, whether you're founding or leading an existing business. As a student, today's episode is a big one. You know Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, one of the most powerful brands in the world, let alone company. You can imagine that he really had something right for sure, which was his market strategy. Andy Cunningham, in today's episode, from a conversation I held with her years ago at Harvard University for our first Student-Run Business Association conference after forming the organization. She worked with Steve as his head of market strategy since the launch of the Macintosh, when everyone else had quit, all the way through Pixar. I really enjoyed talking with Andy. The intro is baked into this one, so I'm going to cut this time short. But suffice it to say, here's what I'll tell you. Andy is a great thinker, somebody I really appreciate, incredible, impressive role model, and good at giving you advice on how to think differently about your business, strategically, and in a way that integrates thinking from the top to the bottom in terms of communications, how you talk to people about your brand. I love what she has to say. I love how she says it. And I really appreciate her book, Get to Aha, which we shared with everyone at that year's conference, now called Surge Expo 25, which you're going to hear more about soon. We hope to see you there at Pennsylvania or at whatever is the next event from Surge. Anyway, enjoy this episode. I'll get out of the way. It's 30 minutes long. You can finish it fast. Talk soon. So I've been very excited to have this conversation with Andy on the stage. Over the past couple days, we've been having a conversation anyway, and I've loved it. We actually have an interesting story of meeting. It was on a plane in Milwaukee. I was heading into Milwaukee from San Francisco, and Andy was sitting next to me diligently typing, so naturally I interrupted her.
Never talk to anybody on an airplane.
She says she never talks to anybody on an airplane. But we had a really excellent conversation about the possibilities of the Student-Run Business Association and what it's trying to achieve long term. And I just felt like it was so natural that I had to ask if she'd be interested in coming and sitting down again. And I'm really glad that it worked out, because I think she's got so much to offer to us and a really great perspective for you guys to hear. So I'm excited for the conversation. But to add a little bit more flavor to her introduction, although she's getting a longer one this evening, in addition to her work with the Cunningham Collective, which is a market strategy consultancy, Andy also published the book that's in your bags, Get the Aha. If you haven't read that yet, I recommend reading it this afternoon.
Just come to the talk tonight. Get the whole book.
There you go. I've been crunching our team to get through it. But she's also on the board of trustees at Menlo College. She teaches there marketing courses, which I love because she gets both the down low in terms of what you're doing in the classroom, as well as the big picture at the universities, which is great perspective for what we're doing here. Andy also has a long history of working with some of the top innovators in the world, from her time with Steve Jobs at Apple, which we'll get into here, to her time with Facebook, Google, Apple again, and then some smaller startups like Tile that have been getting off the ground.
Yep, lots of startups.
Great. So we'll go ahead and dig into the conversation. That gives you some context for what we're talking about here. Right?
Great.
Okay, so Andy, I thought that it would be good to start with, maybe actually if we start with some of your work with those companies we just mentioned. I was wondering if you could give us a couple of examples of some of the work you've been doing lately with them, just so we can get a sense of how this actually works in a market.
So recent work that you've been doing?
Yeah, maybe a more interesting project, just to give a very precise example so we can see into your day-to-day.
Sure. So maybe I could talk about a project you just did with Facebook. It's a really interesting company. I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with Facebook. Facebook's goal in the world is to connect everybody to each other, right? And part of this means they have to find a way to get internet into places in the world where internet doesn't exist. So in order to get everybody on Facebook, which is their ultimate goal, they have to put internet into some of these places. So I'm working with the group at Facebook to help them get internet into places that are underserved by the internet. And Facebook, being Facebook, they sort of think that they are, they really think the whole world knows who they are. And in the civilized world, yes, but in these places where there isn't electricity and there isn't water and there isn't internet, nobody knows who Facebook is. And those who do know who Facebook is, they think Facebook is the internet. They don't understand that Facebook is an application on the internet. So they just sort of steamrolled into these places, in Africa and India in particular, and their notion was that there's no difference between Africa and India. They went with that philosophy, and that the messages that they would use to get their product into these places would be the same all over Africa and the same all over India. Well, it wasn't working. Nobody was agreeing to let them put internet into these places, and so they came to us and they asked us if we could help them figure out what's wrong. Why is this not happening to them? Well, what's wrong is that India and Africa are two very different places, and you don't say the same thing to, they have different motivations for using the internet, by the way. One of the things we learned in Africa is that people who are aware of the internet but don't have access to it want it because they want to make connections with their family and their friends. In India, they want jobs. So it's like they want to use it for their careers. So very different use cases for the internet. So anyway, what we did is we helped change. First of all, we did studies in India and Africa to prove to them that they're different places, and then we helped them with messaging that would be much more localized to the different regions they were going into in each of those two countries. So that's an example.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I sneaked that question up on her, so that's a good example. Okay, so diving back a little bit, I wanted to talk about, because this is a leadership chat, and I know a lot of you guys would be really interested in hearing more about Steve Jobs and your time with Steve Jobs and some lessons for that. Tell us a little bit about your origin story in terms of that relationship, so how you got started on the project at Apple, and explain kind of that whole dynamic, because it's really interesting.
Sure. So, back in the 80s, before many of you were even around in the early 80s, except for you, Jim. Jim and I worked together. I had this incredible opportunity to come out to Silicon Valley from Chicago, where I'm from, and to work on the launch of the Macintosh with an agency called Regis McKenna. Now, Regis McKenna was a public relations agency. I'm sure none of you have ever heard of it. But out in those days and in the technology industry, they were the premier firm. That this man Regis worked with all the major people and the major companies back in the day. And when Steve Jobs started Apple, when he was just a kid, and he actually started the company with the Apple II computer, he sought out Regis and found him and decided to use him as a mentor. And Regis was, of course, very happy to do that. And literally, Regis was teaching Steve how to dress, how to take showers, how to be an adult, because he was just a kid. And so we just became this father figure to Steve Jobs. So when I had this opportunity to work at Regis McKenna and take the role of leading the team that launched the Macintosh, it was an amazing honor to work both with Regis and with Steve. But here's what happened when I came out to Silicon Valley to do this. I had discovered that the entire Apple account that was working at Regis McKenna, with the exception of one young woman who was 22, quit, like right before I got there. And they quit because they had just launched the Lisa computer. Nobody remembers that either. But that was a gigantic failure for Apple, huge. It was a $10,000 computer that was like this big. They actually buried them in a place in Nevada afterwards. They had made so many of them, couldn't sell any of them. They literally physically buried them in the ground in Nevada. It was a doorstop. It was a horrible product. Nobody bought it. So everyone was frustrated. People at Apple were frustrated. People at Regis McKenna. And the whole team quit except for this one young woman. So when I show up 6 or 7 months before the Macintosh launch, it's me. I'm 24 and she's 22. And Regis is like completely frustrated and not involved either. And so he just says to us, write a launch plan for this product. And so she and I spent like a week, like 24 hours a day. We became attached to each other at the hip. And we wrote this launch plan, and Ray just never wanted to look at it. He never saw it. We went over to Apple and we presented it to their head of marketing. And the head of marketing listens very patiently. We actually does anybody know what a Gantt chart is? Okay. So back in the day, we had these things called Gantt charts, which were like project management things. And we made a giant one and we taped it all around the room to show the inflection points of all the things we were going to do with this launch. And when we were done with our presentation, the head of marketing says, we put in a budget of $500,000, which back in the day was a lot of money. And at the end of our presentation, he just looked at us and he said, "Do you need any more money?" It's like, which also never happens in the real world. So it was just one of these incredibly magical things. And then she and I built up a team and ended up launching the Macintosh. But Regis never was involved. I mean, he just let us do it. And so one of the things Owen mentioned to me is that it really did show that young people can be trusted with things, even back then. And I've taken that forward in my career. I love working with young people, and I think when you leave a young person with a challenge and you don't try to help them, I mean, if they ask for help, that's one thing. But if you just sort of let them figure it out, they'll figure it out. And that's what me and Jane did. And so we launched the Mac. She and I, essentially. It was an amazing opportunity. And then, of course, working with Steam was another amazing opportunity.
Yeah. So I think that's an excellent story. I mean, part of what I love there is, yes, hearing that these folks in their early 20s are part of launching what's now totally revolutionary brand.
Changed my life.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be here today if I had launched the Macintosh, I'm sure of that.
And the other thing that strikes me is, I mean, when you look at Steve Jobs, and I want to get into all the pros about Jobs and the things that he did wonderfully that we can learn from. And we're going to dive maybe a little bit further into the cons too, or some of the things that he'd struggled with. But it also strikes me that communication and brand positioning is the most powerful thing about the whole company, or it's at least one of them.
At Apple?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because that's what's enabled them to spread so far and creating a real cult.
Yeah. So, Mike, can I say something about Apple? So, Apple today, when Apple was under Steve Jobs, both the first time and the second time, even after he got fired and then came back to Apple, the company was, and you'll hear this tonight in my book, I have this idea that there are three kinds of companies. There are product-focused companies, I call them mechanics. There are customer-focused companies, I call them mothers, and then there are concept-focused companies, I call them missionaries. Well, under Steve Jobs, Apple was a missionary company for sure, a company trying to change behavior on a broad scale, like fundamentally change behavior. And so when you have someone, a visionary like Steve, running a company like that, he was just capable of coming up with the next big thing over and over and over and over again, right? But when he passed away, and left the company in the hands of Tim Cook, who, by the way, is an amazing steward of those assets. He made that company into the world's most valuable company. But he's not a visionary, and he's not a next big thing guy. So what's happened to Apple over the last few years since Steve Jobs passed away is it's become what I call an essential luxury brand. Now, those are two terms that don't necessarily go together, because who actually needs a luxury? That's the whole point of a luxury, is you don't need it. But Apple has found this position as an essential luxury brand. And they're essential because once you buy into iOS, you're never giving it up because your whole life is on it, right? Your whole life is on it. And yet, they're a high-end brand, and you're going to pay extra to be in that ecosystem. So every product that they introduce, even if it's not a next big thing, is one you're going to buy because it ties into your iOS that you already have. So you're essentially connected to iOS. And you feel like you're with a luxury brand because of the way Apple brands itself and markets itself. It's like the Louis Vuitton of technology. So it's come to this. Tim Cook has led the company to a new position that I call an essential luxury brand. And they're the only one in the world, by the way, that is an essential luxury brand. And that puts them in a very unique place where you can't get off their product because you're addicted to it, and you don't want to because you love it. It's a beautiful position.
And you said your whole life is on it, and that's becoming more and more.
Your whole life. Oh, absolutely. So they just recently introduced a bunch of services, right? Mm. They have a credit card now. They got Apple TV Plus. They got Apple News. They got some of these new things that they're putting forward. And all of that is just sucking you further into the iOS stream.
And these health products.
And the health products, and pretty soon they're going to do transportation. It probably won't be in the next 5 years, but everything is going to go back to iOS. Your whole life will run on iOS if you're an Apple customer. And that's going to keep them at the center of this high valuation that they find themselves in today. So even without the next big thing, they're still going to be one of the world's most valuable companies.
Wow. Yeah. So I think that's powerful because not only these young folks really shaping the world, not only were you at the ground level of that, but you were at the heart of it too.
Yeah.
The most important work.
Yeah, it was an amazing time.
Okay, so a little bit more on jobs. You mentioned that when you got there, everyone had quit. He was pretty tough to work with. Can you get into a little bit of the details on some of the things that made it challenging to work with Steve? And then we'll talk about what made him so inspiring.
Sure. So Steve was a total micromanager. He managed every pixel on the screen, every shade of every pixel on the screen, every word of everything that was written, whether it was a press release or an ad or even just a thing that you would send around internally. He was just an incredible micromanager. And I want to say something really positive about it before I get into some of the negatives. And this is the greatest thing about Steve Jobs is he was entirely focused on one thing, and that was changing the world with the Macintosh. That was it. He had no other agenda. And a lot of other CEOs, I've worked with thousands of them in my career, and a lot of other CEOs have other agendas. And those agendas are typically around power, around money, and oftentimes around women, because most of them are men. But Steve had none of that. He had absolutely none of those other agendas. There was only one. So you knew when you were working with him, it was incredibly refreshing because you weren't trying to balance these other things that he was trying to do, like you're always trying to do with other CEOs. Everything you did was designed to focus on this Macintosh thing. So it was incredibly refreshing. And there were and I like to say that he didn't care how old you were, what gender you were, what sexual preference you were, what race you were. None of this stuff mattered to him. What only mattered to him is could you add to the equation he was trying to create with this Macintosh. You could have been a Martian. It really didn't make it. He made no distinction as to what you were, as long as you were adding value. But the minute you stopped adding value, you were out of there like that. So he was very tough because of that. And like I said, he micromanaged every little detail. But he was also incredibly accepting of whatever kind of person you were to bring value to the equation that he was trying to create. So,
yeah, actually, let's dig back a little bit. You mentioned his focus being singularly on the Macintosh and on the difference and impact he was trying to create. That's another thing we talked a little bit on in the plane.
Yeah,
was the culture in Silicon Valley and how that's changed over time. And you have such a great. You treasure the passive valley and the origin of so much of what's made it powerful today. Tell us a little bit about that spirit that was there before and how it's changed over time.
So when I came to Silicon Valley, it was a place where true, real nerds were in power, right? And more than just in power, they were the ones that were creating these products that were changing the world, and they were really nerdy. They really were. I mean, that's why when I mentioned that Regis had to help Steve figure out how to take showers. That's the level of nerd we're dealing with there. And the valley was filled with them. And these were guys who didn't care about money. They really cared about building a product that was going to change the world. But over time, when their products became super successful, and now there's technology in everything, every kind of company you could possibly imagine uses some of the technology that came out of Silicon Valley. What's happened is the industry has become so large that the other motivations have seeped into the industry now. So now it's an industry that is concerned with making money and is concerned with the power associated with the roles and all of that. And so we have a different kind of a culture. This has sort of led to what has been referred to in Silicon Valley as the bro culture. Has anybody read Emily Chang's book, Brotopia? Or does anybody even know about this book, Brotopia? Emily Chang is a Bloomberg news reporter. She has a show, and she was based in Silicon Valley. She has a show on Bloomberg TV, and she wrote a book called Brotopia, and it's a book about the culture of Silicon Valley and how, in the last, I would say, 15 years, and how it's become a very male-dominated, Uber-esque sort of culture. I thought it was kind of a bullshit thing when I first heard about the book, and I know Emily and I like her a lot, but I read the book, and it's actually a really good history of Silicon Valley over those 15 years. It's actually quite quite well done. But yeah, the culture has shifted a lot because it basically starts with this. If you're going to have an engineering-oriented company, which is what is primarily existing in California, it's going to be primarily staffed with men because there still aren't that many women getting into programming. Where everyone in Silicon Valley is doing whatever they can to get more women involved in it, but for whatever reason, they just aren't. So you build up these engineering teams with very few women, and then a fraternity culture develops, and then you get some of the issues that we now have in Silicon Valley. But we didn't have that back in the day. Back when I was there, nobody was programming, right? Nobody, no men, no women, no nobody. So if you could get anybody to work on this stuff, you did. And so it was a much better balance back in the 80s, believe it or not, between men and women and their quality level than there is today. It's actually gotten worse, which is really a sad thing. We need to get more women into programming. That's like the bottom line. And I'll just say, as a woman in business, I never had any issues in Silicon Valley that we hear about. I never had any of those. But I really think that diversity is an important thing. And so you can't have an engineering department filled with men, but you also can't have a marketing department filled with only women, because the same thing happens over there. It's just a different flavor of it. So diversity in the workplace is a really important thing. It's an important thing to America's culture in the first place, but it's really important in the workplace that you need diverse opinions and perspectives in order to get a better answer. And that's what was so beautiful about Steve Jobs' Macintosh team. It was a very diverse team, all different kinds of ages and everything was involved, and it just created a much better product at the end.
And speaking of diversity and the difference in the culture, then you and I also spoke a little bit about how we need to incorporate more diversity in terms of the arts and maybe some softer skills that can be associated with a feminine perspective. Yeah, talk a little bit about how maybe that played a bigger role then too, or just the dynamic.
Well, again, going back to the guy who Steve Jobs was, he was a person whose entire being was the intersection of art and technology. That's who he was. So a lot of people think he was an engineer. He was not an engineer. He was a person who was a visionary, mostly marketing person. He somehow or other was capable of figuring out what the market was going to want before it had it. And so he never did market research at Apple, ever. Because he used to say, what's the point in doing market research? The market doesn't know what it wants until it sees it, so it's useless. So we never had to do any of that, which is great. But he embodied the whole notion of art and technology together, and that's why everything at Apple was designed so beautifully, because he was an artist at art. He used to say this phrase, great artists steal, which is true, but that's kind of the way he lived his life, which is why everything that he developed was really stealing something from someone else and adding on top of it. He never created anything from scratch. Nothing Apple did. Nothing was original. Everything started somewhere else and then got built on top of, but designed with great beauty, I guess is the way to put it. So he was great.
Original in design and also application and how we introduced it.
Yeah. So he was a showman. That's another thing that people don't necessarily associate with him. But he loved standing up in front of an audience and performing. And so he created these venues for product launches that gave him an opportunity to get up and perform. And he loved it. And by the way, he rehearsed it. He rehearsed everything he said hundreds of times. Nothing ever came out of his mouth in front of a public like that wasn't really well rehearsed, which made him easy to work with as a PR person, because he wasn't one of these guys who just ran off at the mouth people. Everything he said was planned ahead of time, rehearsed ahead of time. And so that made it a lot easier to work.
We'll talk more about how he inspired people. Just before we go there, the fact that he was a person who really combined art and science in a sense, because he had a true appreciation of the engineering, but he also was an artist at heart, you said. Do you think that is part of what enabled him to have a kind of a long-term perspective, this passion about really changing the world or putting a dent in the universe, I think is crazy?
Yeah. I think he was a great believer in beauty. There's a phrase that he used, and I also sit on the board of the Aspen Institute, if anybody knows what that is, but it's kind of a Washington think tank. But
I forgot about that.
Yeah. That's okay. But anyway, there's this notion in philosophy is anybody a philosophy major? Okay, cool. So you probably heard this. It may be worded differently in the textbooks, but this notion of there's a simplicity that lives on the other side of complexity, but you can't get there until you go through the complexity piece of it. Well, this was the goal that Steve was always looking for. He was always looking for that elegance and that simplicity on the other side of complexity. Now, there's always a simplicity on this side of complexity, but that's where people get fooled into thinking that's the real thing. You have to go through the complexity. This goes back to that other discussion we had.
Yeah.
Owen and I both believe very strongly in this notion of it takes 10,000 hours to do anything well. And I guess that was a Malcolm Gladwell comment, but I'm a big believer in that. I don't think things can happen, and what that 10,000 hours is about. It's about getting through the complexity to the other side, and seeing the beauty and simplicity that can exist once you've gone through the hard stuff.
Well, that's like full body training in that regard.
Yeah,
because it's learning it so well and thoroughly and practicing it so much that it becomes intuitive.
Yeah, exactly. And people who do that really well, if you look at a great dancer or a great musician, they make it look easy, but it wasn't easy getting there. so that was bad. I just want to say one other thing about Steve, because we didn't really get into some of the difficulties, and I thought it would be interesting for you to just hear one of the many conversations that he and I had that were difficult. So Steve was a big believer in the notion that the environment in which you are influences your decisions, right? He really believes that your environment mattered. So whenever he was trying to sell his product, if you will, sell the Macintosh, in my case, it was always trying to sell it to the journalism community. We had to like remake the environment in which we were doing that. He wouldn't just have somebody come in and just like talk to them about it. So he chose a hotel in New York called the Carlisle Hotel, which is sort of an old-fashioned, very classy hotel. And he would always take the suite on the top, and he would make them put in a grand piano into this suite. And then we would show up after a flight from California right around 10 o'clock, me and this young woman I mentioned that we were working together, and Steve, and the three of us would redo the entire room. Like at 10 o'clock at night, it would take about 4 hours. So we'd move furniture around, and he would insist on certain kinds of flowers in the room. And one time I had a fight with him. Did anybody see the Steve Jobs movie? Okay, so there's a character in there who plays me. It's the other Andy, the one with the headset on. If anybody remembers that. There was an Andy Hertzfeld who was the software guy, and then there was the other Andy, and that was me. And anyway, this story is replayed in that movie. But Steve insisted on getting a certain kind of flower, and he's describing them to me. Now it's like 1 a.m. in New York, and he's saying, "I got to have these flowers. I have to have these flowers on the piano." And I said, "What kind of flowers?" He said, "Well, they're these long stem green things with a white thing on top." I said, "Oh yeah, that's a calla lily." He goes, "That isn't a calla lily." I said, "Yeah, it is. It's a calla lily." We had this big fight about this calla lily thing for and finally I said, "Okay, it's not a calla lily." And then I went and ordered calla lilies and got them delivered at 2 a.m. and we had calla lilies. And in fact, they were calla lilies. That was one of the things. And that very same night, okay, so now it's like 2 or 3 a.m. and we'd finished doing this room. We had to have strawberries. They had to be strawberries, and they had to be cream, and they couldn't be together. They had to be in separate bowls, and they had to be on top of the piano. Every little freaking detail about the environment was orchestrated by him. So anyway, we're at the end of the evening, and we're heading towards the elevator. And this is you never want to be in an elevator with Steve Jobs. Everybody do that. And so I was going, but there was a small hotel, and I'm heading to the elevator right after him. And I'm thinking, oh shit, I have to be in the elevator with him. So there was nothing else I could do. So I get in the elevator with him, and he goes like that. And all I said to him was, "I know how you feel." And he snarls at me and he goes, "You don't have any fucking idea how I feel." And that was just exactly how he was. And so, a lot of people would have like been totally destroyed by that or hurt or whatever. And what we learned, because we were young, is it just let it roll off. He doesn't mean it to you personally. It's just his feeling at the moment, and we just let it roll off. But there were so many incidents like that. So anyway, I wanted to.
It sounds like the stress kind of got to. Actually, that's something I'm really. It's something I love about the student-run business programs is it gives people a chance to experience that kind of crazy strain.
That's a good thing. Huh?
Yeah. With the company of folks that can help them figure out how to get through it. I think with more compassion.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
these are kind of.
It looks like we don't have a whole lot.
Oh, how are we?
So we got like 5 minutes. So, check you need inspiration.
Yes.
So what I learned from Steve Jobs about leadership, because I do think he was a fantastic leader. He was not a nice leader, but he's a fantastic leader. Is that three things a leader needs to do in order to get a team together and move forward and make something happen. And the first and most important thing is you have to inspire them. But it's more than just, so that means you have to give them a North Star, what you're reaching for. The most important part of inspiration is you have to convince the people that they have a role in getting to that North Star. It's not enough just to have the North Star. Every person that's involved in the team has to understand their role in getting to that North Star. He was amazing at that. And so he chose this group of 100 people to work on the Macintosh, no more. And the minute you weren't playing a role in getting to the North Star, you were off the team. So there was an incentive to stay on the team. So that's the first thing, is the inspiration. Second thing is you have to have an enemy. You have to provide an enemy for your troops. And so his enemy at that time was IBM. And IBM was a very big enemy because they were a very big established company. But he used to have these big signs around the building that had IBM, the logo, and a big red no to it. And he made a big deal about how IBM was the enemy. And in fact, if any of you have seen the 1984 commercial, anybody's seen that? The world's most famous commercial ever. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you Google it. It is, in fact, the world's most famous commercial and one of the most creative. But it was designed to mock IBM employees. That's what that whole commercial is about. So the young woman swinging the sledgehammer is meant to represent Apple. And the drones, the skinheads, who, by the way, were real skinheads, were meant to represent IBM employees. So, number one, inspire people, give them a role in that inspiration. Number two, choose an enemy. And number three, treat that team in an elite sense. I don't think it matters what your DNA is as a company, but you can be a huge success in any one of those three categories that I talked about. For example, I think Apple is an amazingly successful missionary company. I think Microsoft is an amazingly successful product company. And I think that Lyft and Nordstrom are amazingly successful customer-oriented companies. But the key is these companies all have a vision. And what a vision is, and if you look this up online, you're going to find that there's about 100 different definitions of vision. The definition that I go with is a vision is how you view the world and how it will be different because of you or your company. Even you can do this as an individual person too, by the way. Everything that I say that applies to companies also applies to human beings. That's kind of the underlying thesis that I have, is that companies are just like people because they're made of people and they serve people. So visions really are these things that help you figure out, why is the world going to be different because of me? Well, in the case of Steve Jobs, he wanted to put an in kind of computer on everybody's desk. That was what his vision was. In the case of Disney, they want to make everyone happy. So these visions, they drive everything that you do. So you have to start everything with a vision. And it's really the answer to the question is, how is the world going to be different because of me? In Disney's case, the world is going to be happier. In Apple's case, the world is going to have easy-to-use computers.
I think you're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight, or you might at least reference it. But that's something I love for our group too, is just the idea that each of us are capable of making a huge impact. There's something that we can do that only we can do.
Exactly.
And figuring out what that is huge to whatever, well, obviously if you can make that difference, but also just your career success.
Right. Like what I like to say about both people and companies is know what you're made of so that you can make something of it.
That's great. Well, I think that's probably a good place to go ahead and conclude the discussion. But thank you all for listening in, and thanks so much to Andy. We talked earlier today a lot about your background, which is super interesting. And actually, I loved some of those anecdotes about jobs because, I've consumed a lot of literature on his background. I'm like, the Isaacson book.
Right, yes. Which I helped Walter with.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, because you two both work together at the Aspens.
Yes, right. And Stephen asked Walter to do that biography, so it was a requested biography. And Walter didn't know a lot of the people who were there in the very beginning, so I connected him with a lot of people and then gave him a bunch of my own stories.
I'm going to have to go back and read it again. We've been talking, but I really like that. And some of your stories today were different. from
Yeah.
the things that I've heard. So I think that's really fun, and the students will probably enjoy, or anybody, going back to that, because we'll set these out together.
Sure.
Going back to that episode or section of this and listening again. But this time I wanted to dive in, based on our conversation, into this topic of leadership. What do you think are some of the elements of leadership that are worth exploring? Let's start there.
Yeah, well, I think the most important one and the hardest one to learn is delegation.
Okay.
And I think the reason that's so hard is that, especially when you're young, is that it really truly is faster to do it yourself if you know how to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that only takes you so far. And unfortunately, a lot of, especially young people, but even older people, can only see that far, right? So it's like, if I do this myself, they can get done faster, and then I can get onto this next thing and this next thing. When they're looking out a week, not 2 years, especially in a student-run business where they might be gone in 2 years.
Yeah.
So they try to do everything themselves. When in fact, if they would take the extra time up front to learn how to teach someone else how to do what they're doing,
Right.
they can do more. The whole firm can do more.
Yeah.
So delegation to me is the hardest thing to learn how to do, especially if you're good at something.
Right. Well, instead of continuing to cover other factors, let's just dive into this one, because this is really interesting. And, I notice students say that we need to delegate a lot. They say it.
Right.
They have trouble doing it. So what are the root of that challenge? And I think that part of it is that they have to be good enough at it to teach somebody how to do it, or they feel like they do. What do you think are some of the first steps to delegation when there's that initial struggle?
Yeah.
I hardly know how to do it. How can you trust them?
Right. Well, part of it is selecting a team of people. So I read an article in Inc. magazine a number of years ago, but it has stuck with me ever since. And what it said was that people who are good at something tend to want to stay the best at that. And so when they hire a team, they bring on people who are one step below them. So let's say you're a 10 at whatever it is you do, and you want to remain a 10. So the way you remain a 10 in the eyes of your investors or you or your teachers or whatever is you bring in 9s. But then the 9s feel exactly the same way, and they bring in 8s. The 8s feel the same way, and they bring in 7s. And pretty soon you have a company full of 3s and 4s, or a team full of 3s and 4s. And so the first thing about leadership is bringing a team of people together who are better than you at stuff, not worse than your own stuff. And that's really hard to do, because you want all the credit, you want to remain the best.
I think you never know about these quotes on the internet, but that's one I've seen attributed to jobs. It's, I hire people that are smarter
Yes.
than me. So,
Well, it's hard to be smarter than Steve. So I worked with all those people, and I wouldn't say that they were smarter than Steve, but what they were is they were better at one thing than Steve was. So I was better at communication than Steve was.
Right.
Andy Hertzfeld was better at software than Steve was. George Crow was better at hardware than Steve was. So he built a team of people who were really good. They were 10s in their areas of expertise, and he was a 10. He was a 15, and his level of expertise, which in my opinion was vision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting expertise to point out, vision setting.
Yeah.
We talked earlier today, but that's definitely not something that's taught in business school.
No, and it's hard to do. I've been working with a company over the last 3 months or so, trying to help them define a vision, and they can't. They just can't. We were able to get a mission defined, which is sort of the day-to-day thing that you do every day to make your company more attractive. But I really love to start with a vision, because then your mission is what you do every day in service to the vision. You're always trying to reach that North Star.
Yeah.
But this particular company is unable to define a vision. They're unable to examine what the world might look like because of them.
Right.
How is the world different because of now?
Yeah.
It's very hard to do. Not very many. Even with my help, they're unable to do it. Which is good. I shouldn't admit to that failure.
And you
but-
can't just do it for them.
No, you can't. It has to be. In my opinion, it really needs to be the leader of this company.
Right.
Whether that's the CEO or whether Ben happens to be somebody who's leading the product or whatever it is, it's got to come from the company. Because if I give it to them, it's not their
Chances
they
are
won't own
it's
it,
not
right?
gonna make sense.
They
won't take
own it,
ownership
right?
of
They
it.
won't own it. So my experience with this over the most part of my career is that companies do have a vision, and people do have a vision, but you have to excavate it. It's like the Michelangelo thing. It's like David, the statue David, Michelangelo. It's like David's inside there, and Michelangelo's job was to excavate and take everything else away. And that's kind of how I see my job. But even so, sometimes with very product-oriented digital people, it's very difficult for them to express why they're going to change the world, how they're going to world and make it back.
Right. So let's say you're a student or a young leader, and you get in charge. You're put in charge of a team.
Right.
Where the team puts you in charge.
Right.
Who knows? And you have to figure out first what is that vision.
Right.
I mean, especially if it's a new company. But even if it's an old one,
right,
you're probably there to bring a new vision.
Yeah, new leaders can bring new visions to them.
Yeah, and sure, they probably need to anyway because they changed the human element.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a new formula.
Even big companies that change out their CEOs, like Microsoft recently, but in the last few years, changed out their CEO. And the new CEO has a different vision. Because the original vision at Microsoft was to put a personal computer on every desk, filled with Microsoft software. And Satya Nadella's vision, I actually don't know what it is, but it's clear that it's a different vision. I think it's moving everyone to the cloud, speaking in that.
Right. Yeah, you might still be developing it. How long is it?
Yeah, he's. I'm going to say maybe two years. He's been.
So in the situation that you decide to create a new vision, what do you think are some of the first steps to mapping that out or to start to analyze the company, figuring out its vision?
So I think the first thing you need to do when you're going to do anything with a company is look at the assets that the company has.
Right.
And I don't mean that in financial sense. I mean, what are the things that the company has that can be transported to the time that you're in right now?
Right.
So if it's a new company, probably many of the assets can be transported. If you're an old company, there may not be so many. So an example of this is I spent a long time working with BlackBerry. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if students will remember BlackBerry, but BlackBerry is not almost. BlackBerry at one point was the leader in smartphones. I mean, they were the leaders, and everybody had BlackBerry. In fact, everybody so much had a BlackBerry that was called Crackberry, like crack.
Yeah.
So they brought in a new CEO about 5 or 6 years ago to transform the company from a smartphone maker because they lost that battle to Android and Apple.
Right.
Total annihilation.
Yeah.
Total annihilation.
Yeah.
So instead of closing the doors, the board decided that they should transform their company and try to become a software company.
Right.
Which is a huge shift. It's a shift in economic model. It's a shift in sales model. It's a shift in people. It's a shift in product. Everything's different.
Right.
So this fellow, John Chen, who I have a lot of respect for, came in with a goal to change the company to a software company. So I worked with him to help him with this. And what we did is we defined 2 assets that the company had that could be moved into the new world. And those assets were mobility and security. But all the other things that BlackBerry stood for, including the 43 million social media followers they had. 43 million social media followers, led by Kim Kardashian.
Wow.
That we would give a BlackBerry to every year. And she would wear it, and she'd hold it, and she'd put it in her. If you look at older pictures of Kim Kardashian, most of them have pictures of BlackBerry on. Anyway, that wasn't an asset that could transfer into the new world. And because 43 million followers of a product that's dead is useless.
Right, because their profile doesn't necessarily...
Well, they don't make the hardware, right? They're only making the software. So the only things that really were transferable was their mobility, which obviously they had, and then BlackBerry was always known for its security, which is one of the reasons Kim Kardashian loved it. So we took those 2 assets, mobility and security, and started to focus on those as the core of the new BlackBerry. We came up with the phrase, software is the new BlackBerry. We started to proliferate that. So anyway, the point is you got to look at whatever the assets are.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting because I have done some work with clients, and I always started with asset mapping.
Yeah, that's a great place to start.
But I actually I mapped out like their more intangible assets and like IP. But I hadn't gotten into mapping out their like brand assets. And so I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
We need to look at these conceptual assets,
Exactly. And by the way, that's what...
At the beginning.
Yeah, that's what Tim Cook has done with Apple.
Right.
He looked at the assets he was left. And what it was iOS. And that was the asset he was left that he could do something with. Because he couldn't come up with the next big thing, next big thing. Even with Johnny Ive, who was their designer. The person who came up with the next big thing after next big thing was Steve Jobs, not Johnny.
Right.
So even though in the beginning everybody thought Johnny Ive was the asset, he wasn't the asset. The asset was iOS. And so what Tim has done is he's taken that asset and transferred it into the new world without Steve Jobs, and he's adding all these pieces to it, as I said this morning, so that you cannot, I don't know if you use an Apple or not, but anybody who does use an Apple, like your entire life now is centered on iOS. It's
You know,
the heart of your whole life.
Oh yeah, and a note here. I had not been using Apple for a long time, but I couldn't get. There were apps for this, but I couldn't get my phone to integrate with my laptop, and I needed text messaging.
Right. So now you have a Mac.
So I got the iPhone, and then I had to get the Mac.
Right, and do you have
I had
Apple
to get the
TV?
iPad, and then I had to get the Apple TV.
And you'll never go away from it.
No, I'm stuck.
Because not, and
Which
you're-
I don't mind right now.
Right, and I think all of us who are in the Apple ecosystem feel that way. As I said this morning, Apple is the first essential luxury brand.
Yes.
We're addicted to it, and we want it.
And well, we kind of need it.
Right.
I mean,
well,
it's
that's what I
amazing.
mean. We're
That's
addicted to it.
just
We need
switch
it.
out, right.
We need it, and we want it. And
Yeah.
that's awesome, right? Usually brands are you either need or you want.
Right.
It's very hard to get a brand with both need and want.
And that was Steve's vision from the beginning, which is why he pushed the OS, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting just to see that play out.
Yeah, many years later. Well, iOS wasn't really developed until later in his career, but the idea was always to create a lifestyle company. That was always his goal. He felt that computer types things ought to be like appliances. They ought to be just part of your everyday life.
Right.
And boy, have they ever become. They weren't like that when you first started with the Apple II in 1978 or whatever that was.
Sure. And I love what the watch it started.
Yeah,
Just the idea.
because now it is part of your ecosystem. I mean, you and I are both. I'm wearing one right now. It's like I would never go anywhere without it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially as I hear, so I haven't gotten one yet, but the more I hear about the potential implications on health and monitoring,
Yeah.
things like that. Plus, actually, I've got an app on my phone that's tracking my steps.
Yep, me too.
For my university employer to contribute to my HSA.
Oh, really?
Right. Which is, so now I need that to make me money.
Exactly.
Of course, it's not a real trade-off. I'm not making money by paying.
No, but you are making your life a little easier.
I am.
And it's healthier.
And I'm
But
willing
what
to
you're
believe that it's.
what you're giving up is privacy. And I think we all have to realize that in these electronic ecosystems that we are now all in,
Sure.
the cost is privacy.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's something we can dive into for another hour or two.
That's a different topic.
Ignore that one.
It's not really about leadership.
Yeah. So back to leadership. Step one is starting to map out the assets. And I think earlier today you made a comment that anything that we say applies to businesses
Yeah.
can also apply to itself. And so mapping out a person's assets is important.
It's exactly. And I always tell young people this who are looking for a job. It's like, look at yourself and decide what are the 2 or 3 things you are the absolute best at.
Right.
What are those? Maybe it's writing, maybe it's dealing with people, whatever it is. Maybe it's programming, and pull those assets out and make them blossom in your outreach to employers.
Right.
Don't try to have everything you've ever done in there and everything that your mother said you were good at.
Sure.
Right. Just take those couple out and explain why those are going to be useful to this company and this organization.
Yeah, so you're looking for really core things. And I think it's important to point that out. I'm like an overanalyzer. So when I started doing personal mapping a while back, I did this for myself. And I'm a philosophy guy.
Yeah.
Like philosophy. So you can imagine how many pages I fill with my self-analysis.
Your map is several pages long.
Right. I learned by experience about the simplicity on the other side of complexity and how urgently needed it is. Because our brains can't handle that kind of information.
Exactly. And it's getting worse and worse. I mean, when we're in a situation right now where the way our president communicates to us is through tweets.
Right.
It really tells you there's just not enough room in the brain for more. I mean, it used to be long speeches, right? 4-hour speeches, 3-hour speeches.
Yeah,
now it's tweets.
Yeah, that is interesting, and that goes to the question of whether we're working on the simplicity, which side of complexity.
Right, and I don't think we've made it to the other side yet on that front.
Not in politics.
Not in politics, because they revel in the complexity because it makes it easier for them to try release things.
I think that the lights turned off probably because of the motion sensor. We're not dynamic enough.
Oh, there we go. We're not moving around.
That's okay. Yeah.
There you go. You guys go.
So, yeah, I think, hold on, I had something come to me there. You're gonna slice
Then
it
lightning
out.
struck.
So what we were talking about was simplicity on the other. Oh, yeah. The lesson that had come to me was that when we're doing these analyses, we need to be efficient on the front end too. Of just saying, I'm going to look at the core and what really matters,
Right.
rather than getting too lost in the weeds. Epic process, because it's costs time.
It does cost time, but it also you can't focus on everything. Like you can't if you're trying to present yourself to an employer for a job.
Right.
There's not. If you're lucky, you'll get an hour of that person's time. You're not going to get 4 hours.
Right.
So what you should use in that hour is expressing the 2 or 3 things about you that is going to match up with that job.
Yeah.
And show some other things, like show your ability to deal with people, show your ability to listen.
Right.
But don't take every single thing that you've ever done or know about or are good at and
Spill it out.
because it loses its form.
Find what's relevant. Yeah. Okay, so kind of back to the process idea. We're mapping these things out. We're being simple in the way we do it. We're focusing on what really matters for the task at hand, or just the things that are relevant because they're big to us.
Yeah.
And then how do we take that information and start pushing it out into the world or into the future? And say, okay, here's who we are. Where do we go from here?
Right.
Where do we be?
So my philosophy about that is that you need to build a digital footprint for your story. Again, whether you're a person or whether you are a business. So if you so the coffee company we talked about earlier today, right, which is very cool. It looks, knowing nothing about that company, having met Kat, and she's awesome, is that it appears as if where you're sourcing the beans is an asset.
Right.
You're sourcing it from a small farmer with a woman who's kind of the village matriarch, and that's a great story. It's also incredibly relevant. It's sustainable. It fits with. So that asset right there should be a big part of the digital footprint of the story of that coffee company.
Definitely.
Right?
Sure.
So building that digital footprint, in other words, creating a website that really blossoms with that story, creating social media that blossoms with that story, creating other kinds of outreaches, partnerships. Everything should have that sourcing of those beans to a small village farmer as front and center.
I think what's interesting about that is we're taking awareness from ourselves by putting it into creating a digital footprint. We're bringing our understanding of it, strengthening that, sharpening it.
Exactly.
And then we're also sharing it with the team.
Right, and making it all focus on that story. Okay, so one of the mistakes people make when they try to build a digital footprint, whether they're a person or a company, is they try to put in, like, again, all the ingredients, right? Let's just take everything in the refrigerator and dump it into our story. So if you're a company, let's say you are, I don't know, some new software company, you're putting a story out there about product, you're putting a story out there about some case studies that you've done, you're putting a story out there about your new CEO, you just hired a new head of marketing, and all of these stories are individual stories about the company, and none of them tied to the main thing. So see a movie until they'd seen something 7 times about the movie. Whether it was a poster, trailer, whatever, they needed to see it 7 times.
Yeah.
So that's where the rule kind of originated. But it's true. People need to see something 7 times before they do something.
That's it. So you can't waste any of that.
No, you can't waste it. That's exactly the point. Right.
I think an interesting concept that's emerging here, because in a way I tried to guide the conversation to break out a formula. I found a new lead. But I think something that's really obvious, and we know, is that there's not a formula to anything. There are good steps to follow, right? Places to start and things to pay close attention to. We know that we need to set a vision. We can talk about like the specifics of that next. But for a moment, I think we should talk a little bit about that idea that you keep really short way the leader show.
Yeah, well, what I like to say about leaders is leaders all have one thing in common, really only one thing, and that one thing is followers.
Okay, sure.
And so you have to examine what causes a person to follow somebody into something, whether it's a cult leader, whether it's a religion, whether it's a CEO, soccer coach, whatever it is. You've got to examine what it is about that person that is causing you to be a follower.
Right.
And it's different in every case. That's why there is no actual formula. But like I said this morning, there are 3 important pieces to it. One of them is a vision, one of them is an enemy, and one of them is treating the team like an elite group of people.
Right.
So think of a great sports team. Think of, and like the Warriors, because they've really come into their own lately. It's really cool. And, their vision is they want to lead the league. They want to lead the league. Their enemy is, of course, it's easy in a sports situation to define enemies. It's everybody, right? It's all the other sports teams that you're competing with, and there's one or two at the top, and that's who they're competing with. And then treating the team illegally, which that's what Kerr, I can't remember his first name, the coach.
Okay.
Is it Steve Kerr? Anyway.
Admittedly, I wouldn't.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Kerr, that I can't remember your first name, but you are an amazing coach, and you treat that team like an elite group of people, right? And that, by the way, has spread to the athletes on the team as well. Steph Curry treats everybody on the team like an elite athlete.
Yeah.
You know,
You have to treat everybody.
Draymond Jones does the same thing, right? So it's spread to the whole team, so they're all treating each other like they're special. And so those three things, vision, enemy, specialness, is kind of, it's not really a formula, but it's more of a framework that you need to have in order to create leadership. So,
right.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah, for a second, I've heard, it's interesting because we've been applying these ideas to the student-run business program over the past few days too. We defined our vision pretty clearly in terms of the number of businesses we want to hit, the revenue that we want to hit, and the people that we want to have involved, and just kind of picturing it out. Which
right.
But we've also started to create our dragons to slay.
All right, cool. I like it. I like calling them dragons to slay. That's good.
And again, between you and me and our Dragons Harvard's program, we've got to get bigger than that.
Okay, got it.
As fast as we can.
I understand.
Don't let them know.
That's good. That's a great goal.
Yeah, but an interesting thing I'd kind of like to break out the Dragon to Slay is like, what exact function do you think that plays? So we know it's important intuitively, but is it because it keeps people on point, motivated? But we talk about this in terms of competition too. Like, competition is good.
Competition is good, yeah.
And that's something that we want to use for the program too, like creating our own competition so that people stay. But yeah, talk about that as a mechanism.
Well, I think human beings. One of the things you have to know if you're trying to do anything with people, which we're all trying to do things with people, whether we're trying to educate them or whether we're trying to get them to run businesses
or build software,
or build buildings or whatever. Humans are a certain way, right? And you have to work with what humans are. And humans need an enemy.
Right.
They just need, that's why we're so tribal, right? I mean, we are a tribal species. That's how we exist. And that's how politics are kind of really, in my opinion, ruining our world right now with this extreme tribalization.
Right.
It's like, but people need an enemy.
It's easy to make the enemy, and from a political perspective, we need
yes.
them. That's how we mobilize
exactly.
troops.
It's easy to say favorizes that even worse.
Right.
So, but an enemy is critical. It's how humans operate. And just to draw an analogy in the insect world or in the agricultural world. So, what agriculturalists are doing today is using insects in order to deal with crops, right? To deal with harmful things that come to the crops, or if we want to get rid of a fungus or something, you introduce an insect that's going to help take care of that.
Right.
It's so what they're doing is they're figuring out how to use nature, the nature of the insects and the nature of the crop and the nature of the fungus to solve itself with bringing in more of with working with the system. Like if this ant likes to eat that fungus on that piece of corn, that let's bring in more of those ants. We don't have to use chemicals.
Right.
So the same is true with humans. It's like if we know that we know that these ants like to eat these kinds of things and they will solve that problem, then we have to work with that.
Right.
And so working with humans to do what humans do best, which is tribalize, shoot for visions, like to create teams of people around their tribes. We need to work with that.
Yeah.
And good leaders understand how to work with that.
How to work with nature.
Yeah, how to work with nature. We're human beings, right? So,
which is an indicator, I'll note, to the amount of reading that somebody has to do. We're being exposed to ideas to actually be in sync with the reality of how things operate.
Yeah, it's so hard these days to keep up with it. We can't keep up.
Can't keep up with information, but you can become steeped in critical information or themes or the nature of people. I mean, that's one dilution in your perspective.
Yeah.
And that's something anybody can get into.
Yeah, exactly. But you got to just know what you're working with. You have to know what you're working with.